The night had barely begun, yet the city of New York already pulsed with a rhythm only Manhattan could create. Cars honked impatiently outside the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, their headlights reflecting off the towering glass facade, while the red carpet stretched proudly at the entrance. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos walked with confidence, as though the world had been built solely for their presence. Inside, the lobby was a symphony of polished marble, golden chandeliers, and the subtle fragrance of white roses flown in from California. It was, without question, a night designed to display power, wealth, and prestige. The night had barely begun, yet the city of New York already pulsed with a rhythm only Manhattan could create. Cars honked impatiently outside the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, their headlights reflecting off the towering glass facade, while the red carpet stretched proudly at the entrance. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos walked with confidence, as though the world had been built solely for their presence. Inside, the lobby was a symphony of polished marble, golden chandeliers, and the subtle fragrance of white roses flown in from California. It was, without question, a night designed to display power, wealth, and prestige. At the heart of this glittering storm stood Valerie Montgomery, the 30-year-old heiress whose name alone carried the weight of an empire. Tall, commanding, and draped in a crimson designer gown that seemed to drink in the golden light, she exuded an aura of untouchable superiority. Diamonds shimmered at her throat and wrists, each piece worth more than the average family home in New Jersey. Valerie moved through the crowd with the kind of smile that was perfectly calculated, warm enough to photograph well, cold enough to remind everyone that her power was not to be questioned. Meanwhile, weaving quietly between the polished tables and ornate candelabras was Robert Miller, the janitor. His navy blue uniform contrasted painfully against the black tuxedos and shimmering gowns around him. At 32, Robert had spent the last 5 years pushing cleaning carts through the corridors of the Grand Metropolitan, invisible to the very people whose champagne glasses he polished and whose cigarette ashes he swept away. To them, he was a shadow, a necessary shadow, perhaps, but one never worth acknowledging. And for Robert, invisibility had become a kind of armor. But that night, the armor felt heavier than usual. Every sound seemed amplified, the clinking of crystal glasses, the echo of laughter that didn't include him, the faint notes of a jazz quartet warming up near the stage. Each detail reminded him of a life he had once lived. A life filled with music, applause, and the sweet ache of piano keys beneath his fingers. He glanced briefly toward the black Steinway grand piano at the center of the ballroom, its polished surface gleaming like a mirror. For a second, just a second, his chest tightened with nostalgia. Then he looked away. That life was gone. Valerie's laughter, sharp and theatrical, cut across the room. She stood in the center of a circle of business magnates, her voice dripping with irony as she toasted to the generosity of the wealthy helping the unfortunate. Robert caught fragments of her words as he collected abandoned glasses from nearby tables. We must always do our part, though some people were simply born to serve while others were born to lead. The guests chuckled, nodding with indulgent approval. Robert clenched his jaw, though his face remained neutral. After all, janitors didn't have the luxury of opinions. As he bent to retrieve a champagne flute that had rolled under a table, fate intervened. Valerie, stepping backward mid-gesture, collided with him. The movement was small, but the consequences were dramatic. Her glass tipped, spilling golden champagne across the scarlet silk of her gown. The sound of liquid splashing against expensive fabric seemed to hush the entire ballroom. A collective gasp spread through the crowd like wildfire. Valerie's eyes widened with rage as she turned sharply. "You clumsy fool!" she snapped, her voice rising high enough to silence the jazz quartet. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Robert froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He straightened quickly, bowing his head slightly. I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. It was an accident. An accident? Valerie's laugh was cruel, echoing through the room like shattering glass. You ruined a $10,000 gown, and you call it an accident. Her words dripped venom, each syllable meant to wound. Around them, guests leaned closer, phones discreetly raised, eager to capture humiliation disguised as entertainment. Robert's cheeks burned. He wanted to disappear into the marble floor, but instead he whispered, I can pay for the cleaning. Valerie arched an eyebrow, her smirk sharp. Pay? With what, janitor? Your paycheck from mopping hotel floors? Laughter erupted from the crowd. Each chuckle landed like a stone against Robert's chest, crushing him under the weight of ridicule. Then, as if possessed by a sudden inspiration, Valerie's eyes gleamed. She glanced toward the Steinway and back at Robert, her smile curling into a smirk. You know what? She said, her voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. If you can sit at that piano and play better than a professional, I'll marry you. The room erupted in laughter, glasses clinked, phones lifted higher, and Valerie basked in her own cruelty. To her, it was a joke, a moment of theatre that would cement her dominance. But to Robert, the words cut deeper than any insult she had ever thrown. Because the truth was, he could play. He had once lived for those keys. And in that moment, buried beneath layers of humiliation and anger, something long dormant began to stir. Robert lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Valerie for the first time. His voice was quiet but steady. I accept. The laughter stopped. A hush fell over the room. For the first time that night, Valerie faltered, her confident smile flickering. She hadn't expected resistance, much less defiance. The crowd shifted, sensing the air crackle with the promise of something unexpected. Phones remained poised, eyes wide with anticipation. And in that silence, with the world suddenly watching, Robert knew there would be no turning back. The ballroom's murmur returned in uneven waves, as though the room itself hadn't decided whether to laugh or hold its breath. Valerie Montgomery regained her poise with a half-smile that looked stitched into place. The kind of expression you learn in boardrooms where warmth is currency and distance is insurance. Her crimson gown, now blemished by champagne, clung to her like a battle flag that refused to fall. Security will escort you out if this turns ridiculous, she said, almost sweetly, eyes never leaving Robert's. The men around her, executives with perfect watches and restless impatience, shifted, calculating the optics. Valerie raised her glass anew. To resilience, she declared, her voice silk over steel. The toast landed, but something about the room had shifted. The status order remained, yet the certainty had thinned. Robert Miller didn't move. He stood beside a vacant table, fingers unconsciously tapping a rhythm against a folded linen napkin, a cadence he hadn't allowed himself in years. The Steinway at the far end felt like an old friend glimpsed across a crowded subway platform, familiar and unreachable. He closed his eyes for a breath. Juilliard's practice rooms came rushing back, the dry scent of rosin clinging to the air from a cellist next door, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, the way a scale under the fingertips could steady a turbulent mind. He remembered the note his mother had left him on a post-it the morning of his first conservatory jury, "Play like the room is listening." He exhaled. Tonight, the room was listening for all the wrong reasons. From the service corridor just beyond a gold-framed mirror, Mary Collins watched with the seasoned caution of someone who knows when a storm changes direction. 25 years at the Grand Metropolitan had taught her the choreography of gala nights. Glide when they glide, pause before they pause, appear only when invisibility would be a disservice. She had seen Robert arrive 5 years ago carrying a silence heavier than his broom, an ache that didn't spill, even when a guest was cruel or a manager was careless. Now she caught the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw unclenched as his eyes traveled to the piano. Mary whispered to a young server, "Give it a minute before clearing table 6. Her tone made it sound like housekeeping advice. In truth, it was an intermission call. A cluster of younger guests drifted closer to the stage, as if pulled by an algorithm. Jason Carter, hoodie peeking from under his rented blazer, held his phone in vertical grip, the red record dot glowing like a tiny sun. "Manhattan main character vibe," he breathed to no one in particular, the caption already forming in his head, "Heiress versus Janitor, plot twist at a charity gala." He filmed Valerie's smile, then panned to Robert's steady profile. In the corner, a tall figure adjusted his cufflinks with the absent-minded care of someone used to listening for subtext. Richard Hamilton, the music critic whose sentences could make or unmake a season. He wasn't filming. He was watching the hands. "Pianists confess with their fingers," he liked to say. "Everything else is small talk." Valerie's circle tightened. Kathy Brooks, pearls and pragmatism, leaned in just enough to be heard over the band's tentative vamp. "Damage control," she murmured. "We pivot to humor, then charity. Let him try, let him fail, we donate a wing, everyone forgives the dress." Valerie's gaze flicked from Kathy to the Steinway. Humor had been her first language. Domination, her fluency. Yet a small, unwelcome memory surfaced. Being 14 at a shareholder dinner, stumbling over a prepared line, her father's hand pressing between her shoulders. "Smile until it stops hurting." She smiled now, because it still helped. "Let him try," she echoed, as if it had been her idea all along. "We'll make a good story of it." Robert moved at last, pushing his cart toward the wall. The wheels squeaked. The room heard it. He straightened the silverware on a sideboard that didn't need straightening, then turned his palms face down, smoothing invisible creases along his sleeves. The etiquette of invisibility had always required neat edges and soft footsteps, but the etiquette of performance demanded something riskier, presence. He let the thought itch. On a night like this, presence could flay you alive or stitch you back together. He glanced at Mary. She gave the smallest nod, a cue he translated as, "If you walk, walk like it was always your job to cross that floor." The jazz quartet, sensing narrative, slipped into a hush made of brushed cymbals and a bass heartbeat. Conversation thinned to the clink of a single glass somewhere near the back. Valerie lifted her chin, the Queen addressing a petitioner. "Well then, Mr. Janitor," she said, savoring the title, "let's not keep New York waiting." Her laughter came late and didn't echo as far as it used to. Phones rose like a field of small antennae. Somewhere beyond the chandeliers, winter hummed against the windows. Robert stepped away from the service path and aimed himself deliberate, unhurried, at the Steinway. The room inhaled, the way a city does before the first snow. The Steinway Grand stood under a halo of crystal light, its black lacquered surface reflecting the chandeliers like a still pool waiting for a stone. Robert Miller approached it as if it were both altar and battlefield. Every footstep echoed louder than it should have, magnified by a room that now demanded spectacle. Phones hovered mid-air, their little red lights blinked with the impatience of 1,000 unseen watchers. He reached the bench, touched the cool edge with his fingertips, and drew a breath that seemed to scrape his ribs from the inside. For 5 years he had avoided this moment, smothering it with bleach and mop water. Tonight, the past had found him in front of everyone. Valerie Montgomery tilted her head, wineglass poised like a prop in a play she had directed. "Don't be shy, Robert," she purred, his name tasting foreign on her tongue. The crowd rippled with stifled laughter, the kind that hurt more than open mockery. Kathy Brooks whispered to her, "Smile, make it entertaining." Valerie obeyed, but her eyes flicked nervously toward the critic leaning near the back wall. Richard Hamilton was scribbling something on his notepad. That pen was sharper than any dagger in Manhattan society. Robert lowered himself onto the bench. The leather was cool and supple, the scent of polished wood rising like an old memory. His hands hovered above the closed lid for a moment, shaking not from fear, but from recognition. He remembered Juilliard's recital hall, the hush before he touched the keys, the way his professor once said, "The silence before the first note is as important as the note itself." Tonight, silence felt like judgment. He opened the lid with a soft lift, and the audience leaned forward as if a curtain had risen. Mary Collins, still at the service corridor, clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. She knew this man had carried something heavy since the day he first clocked in. She had caught glimpses, the way his eyes lingered on the hotel's lobby piano when he thought no one noticed, the way he straightened sheet music left behind by careless musicians. She whispered under her breath, "Play, son. Remind them you were never invisible." Robert placed his fingers on the ivory keys. They fit like an old pair of gloves, molded to him by years of practice, grief, and silence. He closed his eyes and let the memory of his mother's voice anchor him. Play like the room is listening. And so he began, not with a showpiece, not with fireworks, but with a melody simple enough to disarm the arrogance around him. 3 notes, then 5, then a phrase that carried both restraint and longing. The room froze, laughter died in throats, champagne glasses halted mid-air. The simple tune, a lullaby his mother once hummed when Manhattan skyscrapers were still dreams, spread through the ballroom like warm light across frost. Phones kept recording, but no one dared add commentary. Even Jason Carter, TikTok at the ready, forgot to add captions. His jaw slackened. Wait, he can actually... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Valerie's smile faltered, her glass trembling slightly against her crimson lips. This was not the shaky improvisation she had expected. This was control. This was elegance. And worse, this was art. She shifted in her heels, suddenly aware that the joke had slipped from her hands like spilled champagne. Around her, guests exchanged glances, their amusement curdling into awe. Richard Hamilton's pen stopped scratching. He simply listened, his eyes narrowing with recognition. Robert's hands danced with growing confidence. He shifted from the lullaby into variations, gentle harmonies first, then daring turns, as though peeling away layers of his own exile. Each phrase was a confession, each chord a reminder that silence had never killed the music, only buried it. The air thickened with reverence. People leaned in, their laughter forgotten, their eyes wide with reluctant admiration. Even the chandeliers seemed to vibrate, casting shards of light that mirrored the tremors in Valerie's chest. As the final note of his first piece hung in the air, delicate as spun glass, the room erupted not with applause, yet, but with something louder. Silence heavy with disbelief. Robert kept his eyes closed, letting the quiet stretch like a bridge to something greater. He wasn't done. He shifted seamlessly into a second piece, faster now, bolder, like a man no longer asking permission to exist. And the crowd understood. They weren't watching a janitor anymore. They were watching a musician reclaim his throne. The second melody spilled into the ballroom, like fire slipping into dry timber, slow at first, then impossible to contain. Robert's fingers flew across the keys, weaving complexity into the air, his posture steady but alive with urgency. Each chord echoed like thunder rolling in from some unseen horizon. Guests who had leaned forward during the lullaby now stood still, wine glasses untouched, eyes riveted on the janitor who had turned into something else entirely, an artist reclaiming oxygen. From the back of the room, Richard Hamilton adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowed in something dangerously close to admiration. He whispered, not to anyone in particular, "I know this man." The words carried, because silence makes whispers louder. A woman nearby turned. "Who is he?" she pressed. Richard's pen tapped against his notebook as if chasing a memory. Robert Miller, Juilliard. He was supposed to be the next great American pianist. The revelation slid into the crowd like a spark across dry leaves. Heads turned, phones refocused. A collective murmur spread. Robert wasn't just anyone. He had been someone. Valerie Montgomery's grip on her champagne glass tightened until her knuckles whitened. This wasn't how it was meant to go. She had orchestrated humiliation, and instead she was being upstaged at her own gala. Worse, she felt a cold ripple of fear at the realization the ridicule she had intended was becoming her own. She glanced desperately at Kathy Brooks. Kathy, seasoned in damage control, leaned in with urgency. "Play it light, Val. Laugh it off. Call it entertainment. If this flips against you, your reputation burns faster than his chords." Valerie forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mary Collins, still in the shadows near the service entrance, felt tears pricking her eyes. She had known pieces of Robert's story, but never the full weight of it. Now, hearing the critic confirm his past, she realized the scope of the man's fall and his rise tonight. She muttered softly, "Let them see you, Robert. Let them finally see." Her voice trembled like a prayer. Jason Carter, live streaming without restraint, whispered excitedly to his phone, "Guys, I'm not kidding. This janitor is crushing it. They say he's like Juilliard level. This is insane. This is going viral." His chat exploded in emojis and all caps, thousands of viewers flooding the stream. Notifications popped like fireworks across the ballroom as guests realized clips were already online. What had begun as humiliation was becoming spectacle, and spectacle was becoming legend. Robert's music shifted again, slowing into a passage so tender it quieted even the buzzing of phones. His eyes remained closed, but his mind was open to memories. He remembered the recital hall where his parents had once sat in the front row, faces glowing with pride. He remembered selling his piano after their accident, feeling like he had buried them twice. Each note tonight was both confession and resurrection. And though the crowd couldn't know the details yet, they felt it. They felt that the janitor wasn't merely playing music, he was bleeding truth into the room. When the final phrase fell away, leaving the ballroom drenched in silence, it was broken not by laughter nor mockery, but by something Valerie dreaded most: applause. It started with one pair of hands, Richard Hamilton's, and then another and another, until the room thundered with ovation. Guests stood, clapping with genuine awe, a standing ovation for the janitor. Valerie's stomach twisted, her carefully constructed mask cracking under the weight of the reversal. Tonight, she had intended to prove that some people were born to be invisible. Instead, Robert had turned invisibility into brilliance. The applause lingered like a storm that refused to roll away. Robert Miller remained at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys, as though afraid to break the fragile reverence in the room. The question from Richard Hamilton, "Why did you ever stop playing?" hung in the air, heavy as smoke. For a moment, Robert thought of deflecting, thought of pretending the past was a locked box never to be opened. But every eye in the ballroom was fixed on him, demanding an answer. And tonight he was done being invisible. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "5 years ago," he began, voice low but carrying in the hush, "my parents were killed in a car accident. Everything I had, everything they worked for, disappeared in a moment. They spent their lives supporting my music, even when it meant sacrificing their own comfort. They believed in me, maybe more than I believed in myself." His voice cracked on the last word, but he pressed on. "When they died, I found out the truth. They had spent everything, left nothing but debt. I sold my piano, my home, everything I had left, just to cover the bills. A murmur rippled across the audience, not of mockery, but of disbelief and sympathy. The glamour of the gala dimmed under the weight of tragedy. For once, even Valerie Montgomery's carefully poised smile faltered. She shifted in her chair, uncomfortable, as if the velvet cushions had turned to stone. Kathy Brooks leaned in to whisper, "Don't react. If you look cold now, they'll never forgive you." But Valerie couldn't stop her eyes from darting to Robert, guilt prickling her skin. Mary Collins stepped forward slightly from the shadows, her voice carrying unexpectedly strong across the hall. "He's telling you the truth." Heads turned, whispers hushed. "I was here when he first came to the hotel," she continued. "He was broken. I knew there was more to his silence than anyone guessed. But I didn't pry. I thought maybe invisibility was the only way he could survive." Her words fell like a benediction, confirming what Robert had kept buried for years. Robert lowered his gaze to the keys, fingers tracing the ivory like a man running his hand along a gravestone. Every note reminded me of them. Every chord felt like a funeral. So I stopped playing. I told myself I was done, that music was over. But music never leaves you. It waits. It waits until you're ready to face it again. He lifted his head, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Tonight, thanks to this challenge." His glance at Valerie was not angry, but steady. "I remembered who I was, and maybe who I can be again." Jason Carter, live stream still running, whispered into his phone mic, "Oh my God, this is crazy. He's literally confessing his life story. This is not just a video, this is a movie." Thousands of viewers flooded the chat with crying emojis, hearts, and the word respect flashing across the stream. The internet was devouring every second, turning Robert's pain into proof of resilience. Silence followed his words, thick and reverent. Then applause erupted again, louder, fiercer, not for the performance this time, but for the story, for the man. Guests who had never looked twice at a janitor found themselves wiping at their eyes. Valerie, trapped in the spotlight she once controlled, felt the weight of her earlier cruelty crash down on her like falling glass. For the first time in years, she doubted herself. For the first time, she saw Robert not as the help, but as a man carrying a grief she could neither buy nor control. The question cut through the air like a blade. Why waste 5 years cleaning floors instead of honoring your gift? For a moment, the ballroom stiffened, the glamour of crystal chandeliers and tailored suits paling against the rawness of accusation. Robert Miller inhaled sharply, his gaze fixed on the keys beneath his hands. He had expected applause, maybe even pity, but not the challenge that now demanded more truth than he had ever shared in public. "I didn't waste them," Robert said slowly, voice carrying despite its softness. "I worked. I paid debts. I learned humility. Sometimes the world doesn't give you a stage. You sweep the stage so others can stand on it." His eyes flicked up toward the crowd. Those 5 years weren't glamorous, but they were real, and sometimes dignity looks like doing the work no one sees. His words resonated, heavy and undeniable, echoing off the marble walls. Phones buzzed like cicadas in the hush that followed. Notifications flashed as clips went viral in real time. Jason Carter's livestream ticked past 100,000 viewers, his chat exploding with comments. "This guy is a legend. Janitor to maestro. Respect." Hashtags bloomed across Twitter and Instagram. Josh Janitor Virtuoso. Josh from Floors to Fame. Josh Robert Miller. The digital world devoured the scene, amplifying every note and every word to millions far beyond the ballroom. Valerie Montgomery felt her throat tighten. What had begun as her cruel entertainment was now a wildfire of attention she could no longer control. Kathy Brooks gripped her wrist discreetly. "Valerie, it's everywhere already. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. If you don't get ahead of this, you'll be branded as the villain who mocked a grieving prodigy." Valerie's practiced composure cracked. Her pulse thundered. She had spent her life curating perfection, and now her empire teetered on the edge of humiliation. From the back, Richard Hamilton finally stepped forward, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Mr. Miller," he said, his tone formal yet charged, "talent like yours does not disappear. It waits. Tonight you proved that. But tell me, are you ready to stop hiding?" His voice carried authority, demanding an answer not just for himself, but for the city, for the watching world. Robert met his gaze. "I didn't come here to prove anything. I came to work. But maybe tonight, the world decided I had something left to prove to myself." His fingers brushed the keys again, and a soft arpeggio filled the silence like a heartbeat returning after years of absence. Mary Collins felt her eyes sting. She whispered fiercely to no one in particular, "He's not hiding anymore. They can't make him invisible again." She looked around and saw even the wealthiest guests leaning forward, listening not with arrogance but with awe. Valerie's glass slipped slightly in her hand, droplets of champagne staining the white linen at her table. Around her, the applause swelled again, not tentative, not polite, but thunderous. This wasn't just admiration for a janitor who could play. It was defiance against her cruelty, a collective rejection of the old order she embodied. For the first time, Valerie Montgomery felt cornered, not by money, not by rivals, but by truth itself. The words detonated like a bomb in the ballroom. She promised to marry him if he played better than a pro. Jason Carter's shout, amplified by his phone and echoed by gasps, spread through the room faster than wildfire through dry grass. Guests who had been clapping moments before now exchanged wide-eyed stares. Some covered their mouths, others immediately pulled out their own phones to confirm. Within seconds, the promise, once a cruel joke, had become a binding contract in the court of public opinion. Valerie Montgomery felt her world tilt. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin pale against her crimson gown. She shook her head sharply, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle. "Oh, come now, it was a joke. Surely none of you thought I was serious." Her words were meant to soothe, but they rang hollow. A murmur of disapproval ran through the audience. Kathy Brooks gripped her arm beneath the table, hissing, "Don't dismiss it, Val. Cameras caught you. The internet loves promises broken by the rich. If you deny it now, you'll look worse than heartless. You'll look cowardly." Robert remained seated at the piano, his face calm, but his chest tight with conflicting emotions. He hadn't wanted this, not in the way it was happening. He had wanted dignity, not spectacle. Still, he could feel the eyes of every guest, every phone, every unseen viewer across the globe pressing against him. "I didn't ask for marriage," he said steadily, voice low but firm. "I only asked for respect." His words rang like steel, slicing through the tension, but the crowd wasn't ready to let go. Richard Hamilton, sharp as ever, added his own voice to the storm. "Respect isn't the issue now, Mr. Miller. The issue is her word. Society runs on promises, kept or broken, and tonight hers was made in front of witnesses." His gaze turned deliberately toward Valerie. "The world is watching." Valerie's hand trembled so violently she nearly dropped her glass. Mary Collins stepped out from the shadows, her voice strong, echoing through the hall. "Sometimes promises said in cruelty are the ones that most need keeping. They reveal who you truly are." A hush followed her words, and for a moment Valerie felt exposed, her arrogance laid bare for all to see. Jason Carter's phone dinged loudly, the notification flashing like a spotlight. "1 million views," he shouted, his voice giddy with disbelief. "It's trending #1 on TikTok, Twitter, everywhere. Does Valerie Montgomery promise?" The guests turned in unison toward Valerie, their curiosity now sharpened into expectation. Valerie rose slowly, her heels clicking against the marble as though marking time in a trial. She forced a smile that wavered at the edges. "Do you all truly believe I should marry a janitor because of a game? Her words dripped with disdain, but the crowd's silence was answer enough. No one laughed with her. No one rescued her. She was alone in a cage she had built with her own cruelty. Robert stood, finally stepping away from the piano. His eyes met hers, not mocking, not pleading, but steady. "It was never about marriage," he said, his voice carrying dignity that silenced the restless whispers. "It was about whether people like me are seen as human, whether we matter." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable, many recognizing their own complicity in the way they treated those who served them. The ballroom hummed with restless energy, a hive of whispers and flashing phones, as Valerie Montgomery realized she could not withstand the eyes of the world much longer. Her carefully manicured facade cracked with every notification ping, every murmur of "she promised," every camera lens angled at her face. She caught Robert Miller's steady gaze across the piano and felt something she hadn't in years: cornered. For a woman who had spent her life controlling narratives, she had suddenly become the story. Robert stepped down from the stage, his movements deliberate, his dignity intact, even as chaos swirled around them. He extended a hand, not as a suitor, but as a man offering escape from a stage too cruel for either of them. "Let's talk," he said simply. The words, calm yet resolute, sliced through the clamor like a conductor halting an orchestra. Valerie hesitated, her pride screaming against the gesture, but the weight of 1,000 eyes left her no choice. She placed her hand in his. The ballroom gasped, phones rose higher, and the murmur surged like a tide. Kathy Brooks leaned close, her whisper sharp as glass. "Val, you need this. Go, pretend control, find an exit strategy. Don't collapse here." Valerie nodded stiffly, her mind a cyclone of fear and fury. Together, she and Robert walked toward the exit, his calm presence contrasting with her trembling steps. Guests parted for them like water, creating a corridor of stares and speculation. Jason Carter's voice rang out above the din. 2 million views already. This is insane." The crowd buzzed louder, but Robert did not look back. Upstairs, the executive office of the Grand Metropolitan felt like another world. The polished mahogany desk, the leather chairs, the city skyline beyond the glass, it all screamed of power, control, decisions made behind velvet doors. But tonight, the office became a confessional. Valerie shut the door with a click that echoed like a prison cell closing. She leaned against it, her chest heaving. "You don't understand what you've done," she spat, though her voice quivered with exhaustion more than venom. Robert remained standing, his posture straight, his tone calm. "I didn't do this, Valerie. You did. I didn't ask for your challenge. I didn't ask for marriage. I only asked to be treated like a human being. The rest, that was your arrogance speaking, not me." His words landed heavy, undeniable. Valerie's laugh cracked, brittle and hollow. She moved toward the desk, pacing like a caged animal. "You don't get it. My entire life is built on image. Investors, partners, family. If I marry a janitor, I lose everything. If I refuse, I'm branded a liar to millions. Either way, I'm ruined." Her voice broke into a near scream, then collapsed into a whisper. "I can't win." Robert stepped closer, his eyes softening though his voice carried steel. "Maybe winning isn't the point. Maybe it's about being better than the person you were when you made that promise. You have a choice: double down on cruelty or start building something real." For the first time that night, Valerie faltered, tears brimming at the edges of her eyes. "Do you really think I can undo this? That anyone will see me as more than a spoiled heiress who humiliated a grieving man?" Her vulnerability cracked open like porcelain. Robert exhaled, his tone gentler now. "You can't undo it, but you can transform it. Make this the night you stop hiding behind diamonds and boardrooms, the night you start treating people with dignity. You don't have to marry me, But you do have to decide what kind of person you'll be when you walk back into that ballroom. Valerie turned toward the city skyline, the lights of Manhattan shimmering like judgment. Her reflection in the glass no longer looked untouchable. It looked tired, human, small. For the first time, she asked not as a socialite, but as a woman cornered by her own mistakes. "And if I fail?" Robert's reply was simple, steady, almost tender. "Then at least you'll fail trying to be better, instead of living as the worst version of yourself." The heavy oak door opened, and the noise of the ballroom washed over Robert Miller and Valerie Montgomery like a tidal wave. Hours seemed to have passed inside that office, though in truth it had been less than 20 minutes. Yet in that short span, the world outside had changed. Phones still glowed like fireflies in the crowd. Guests clustered in circles, buzzing about the scandal, their anticipation thick as smoke. On Jason Carter's livestream, the viewer count had soared past 3 million. Every eye in the room turned as Robert and Valerie re-entered, side by side. The chatter died down to a charged silence. Valerie's heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing like judgment. Robert walked beside her with calm dignity, shoulders straight, eyes steady. They mounted the stage together, an odd pair, janitor and heiress, yet all the grandeur of the ballroom bowed before them. Valerie swallowed hard, the microphone heavy in her hand. For once in her life, words did not come easily. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier as she spoke. "Tonight I made a promise in cruelty. I mocked a man I did not see for who he was. I called him invisible, unworthy, and I was wrong." The room shifted. Gasps mingled with murmurs. The Valerie Montgomery they knew never admitted fault. Her diamond earrings sparkled under the chandeliers as if mocking her humility. Yet her words were raw, unpolished, real. "Robert is not invisible. He is extraordinary, and my behavior tonight was shameful." A ripple of surprise swept the crowd. Mary Collins pressed a hand to her chest, whispering a prayer of thanks. Jason Carter's phone caught every word, his audience exploding in comments. "She's apologizing. Is this for real? Respect if she means it." For the first time all night, the internet seemed willing to shift its fury into something else: curiosity. Robert stepped forward, taking the microphone with a nod. His voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of truth. "I never asked for marriage. I asked for dignity. Tonight isn't about humiliating Valerie in return. It's about proving that no one is invisible. We all have value, whether we wear tuxedos or uniforms." His words, simple yet piercing, struck the crowd deeper than any melody he had played. Even Richard Hamilton, the critic, found himself blinking back unexpected emotion. Valerie lifted her chin, still shaken but braver than before. "Robert and I have come to an agreement," she continued, her voice stronger now. "I will honor my promise, not with a marriage born of mockery, but with action. I will use my resources to help him return to the stage where he belongs, to help him rebuild the career he was forced to abandon." Gasps gave way to applause, some hesitant, some fervent. The promise of transformation, hers and his, hung in the air like a fragile truce. Robert smiled faintly, turning toward her. "And in return," he added, "I've agreed to help Valerie see the world differently, to treat every person she meets with dignity, no matter their station. We will hold each other accountable, not as husband and wife, but as partners in growth." The crowd erupted into applause, louder and fuller than before. Valerie glanced at the audience, then at Robert, and for the first time that evening, she didn't see a janitor or an adversary. She saw a man who had forced her to confront the truth. Her hand trembled as she extended it toward him. Robert accepted it firmly, the handshake sealing their pact under the glittering chandeliers of the Grand Metropolitan. The ballroom was hushed, anticipation quivering in the air like the pause before a storm. Richard Hamilton's challenge still echoed. Would you consider performing again, not for us, but for everyone? The crowd leaned forward, their diamond bracelets and cufflinks forgotten, their focus solely on Robert Miller. He stood at the center of the stage, shoulders squared, the weight of 5 silent years pressing down on him. Yet, in that moment, he realized the silence had already been broken. Robert turned slowly toward the Steinway Grand, its polished black surface gleaming beneath the chandeliers. The piano was no longer a symbol of exile, but of resurrection. He placed a hand on the lid, inhaled deeply, and whispered, barely audible, yet somehow carrying across the hall, "For them." The audience didn't need an explanation. They felt the ghosts in his voice, his parents, his past, his pain. He sat down, the bench creaking softly beneath him, and let his fingers hover above the keys. The ballroom seemed to shrink around him, the crowd fading into shadow, leaving only Robert and the piano under a single, golden pool of light. The first notes rose, delicate and shimmering, like dawn spilling over the Manhattan skyline. Each phrase was tender, intimate, weaving sorrow and hope into one seamless tapestry. The music grew, swelling into cascades of sound that filled every corner of the room. Robert played not for wealth, not for revenge, but for humanity. Each chord was a reminder that dignity could not be bought, only given and received. The notes tumbled like rain, rose like prayer, and crashed like waves against the marble walls. Guests found themselves holding their breath, tears slipping silently down cheeks powdered and painted for gala perfection. Valerie Montgomery stood just a step behind him, no longer the untouchable heiress, but a woman stripped bare by truth. Her eyes glistened as she watched Robert's hands glide over the keys, each movement a lesson she had never sought, but now desperately needed. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the center of attention, and she felt lighter for it. Jason Carter's livestream captured the moment in real time. His phone trembled in his hands as the chat exploded. "This isn't just music, it's history. I'm crying right now." From Janitor to Genius, viewers poured in by the hundreds of thousands, the count climbing past 5 million. Clips spread to every corner of the internet, the story rewriting itself with every share. The janitor who played like a god, the heiress who was humbled, the knight dignity conquered cruelty. The final passage slowed, a gentle diminuendo that drew the crowd closer with every note. Robert closed his eyes, letting the last chord resonate until it dissolved into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted, not in polite applause, but in thunderous ovation. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even shouting his name. The chandeliers trembled with the force of it. Robert rose from the bench, his chest rising and falling, his soul lighter than it had been in years. He turned toward Valerie, who stepped forward, her voice unsteady but strong. "Tonight, I learned that true greatness isn't measured in wealth or status. It's measured in how we treat others." Robert reminded me of that. And I promise you all, this will not be the end of his music. It will be the beginning. The crowd cheered louder, cameras flashing like stars, the story sealing itself into legend. And in that moment, Robert Miller was no longer invisible. He was seen, fully and undeniably, by a world that would never forget his song. The ovation in the Grand Metropolitan seemed endless, a roar that shook the chandeliers and reverberated into the New York night. Robert Miller stood at the piano, his fingers still tingling from the final chord, his heart beating like a drum that had been silent for too long. Valerie Montgomery stood beside him, not as the untouchable heiress who once mocked him, but as a woman who had been forced to confront her reflection in the harshest mirror imaginable. Robert stepped to the microphone, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of the night. "All my life, I believed music was my gift, But what I learned is that dignity is the greater song. Every person you ignore, every word you speak in cruelty, it leaves an echo. Tonight proved that no one is invisible. Not me. Not anyone. His gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of billionaires, waiters, and staff alike. And maybe the world will remember that. Valerie swallowed hard, then raised her own voice. I mocked him because I thought power made me untouchable. But tonight, I saw the truth. Real power doesn't come from wealth or titles. It comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. If I can change, then maybe anyone can. The sincerity in her tone startled even her closest friends. The crowd stood in stunned silence before the applause surged again, but this time it wasn't just admiration, it was reflection. Some bowed their heads, others wiped their eyes. Richard Hamilton closed his notebook, whispering to himself, "This isn't just a review, this is history." Mary Collins, her hands clasped, whispered a prayer of gratitude. He's seen at last. Jason Carter's livestream comments flooded the screen. I'll never forget this. She admitted she was wrong. Wow. Respect, Robert. The view count ticked past 10 million, the story already cementing itself as the legend of a janitor who reminded the world that every life has value. Robert's eyes softened as he stepped closer to the microphone one last time. If this story touched you tonight, let it change how you see the people around you. Look for the invisible, listen to them, value them, because everyone has a song. He paused, then added with quiet conviction, don't wait for a piano to remind you. The final words settled over the ballroom like a blessing. Then, with humility, he gestured toward the audience. Tell me in the comments below. Have you ever felt invisible? Share your story. Someone out there needs to hear it. And if you believe in second chances, in music, in dignity, subscribe, because there are more stories to tell. The ovation swelled once more, but Robert didn't need it. He had already won back the only stage that mattered, his voice, his worth, his dignity. And as he left the piano, walking not as a janitor but as a man reborn, the world watched and listened.